Last week's Gospel was the beginning of chapter 6 of John's Gospel. We had that unbelievable story of the multiplication of loaves, showing Jesus' great compassion for the people. This week is a continuation of chapter 6 of John's Gospel, in which Jesus approaches hunger in a different way. The people were filled last week. In fact, they had leftovers. But their physical hunger would come back. In today's Gospel, Jesus says to them, I will feed you forever, all the way into eternity, because whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. Now, let's go back for a moment to last week's Gospel, because at the end of that Gospel, it said Jesus knew the people were going to come and take him away to be their king, and he slipped away. However, in this week's Gospel, they found out where he was going. He was going to Capernaum, and they got there first. And they start this dialogue with Jesus about wanting to know if he'll give them a sign of, is he the Messiah or not? Jesus says an interesting thing to them. He says, you're here because I fed you. You want another sign? And they said, well, our father Abraham gave people manna in the desert. Jesus goes, no. Abraham didn't give them manna in the desert. It was my Father who gave them manna in the desert. By the way, as you know, the first reading today was exactly that story of the people complaining to Moses, and Moses takes it to God, and he gives them the wonderful miracle of the manna in the desert. Now, in today's Gospel, as Jesus follows up in this discussion, he starts talking about, I am the bread of life. Notice the contrast between last week's Gospel and this week's Gospel. He's saying to the people, look for more than just being fed constantly physically. Look for the way I'm going to spiritually feed you. I'm going to give you bread for eternal life, but you have to make an act of faith in who I am and how I can feed you. Now, often when a teenager goes through that rebellious stage and they say to the parents, I don't want to go to Mass, I get nothing out of Mass. Well, the proper response to that is, you get Jesus out of Mass. Of course, that's going to take an act of faith on their part, just like Jesus was inviting the people to make an act of faith when he says, whoever feeds on me will have eternal life. Now, the important thing for us to take away from all of this is, number one, we have to believe not only is Jesus our Messiah, but he really is, in the bread and wine, after consecration, food for our spiritual life, for our spiritual journey. The other thing we want to take away from this is that every day we have an opportunity to continue to make that act of faith. Even ourselves in this very, very secular world can be tempted to doubt the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Today's Gospel should clarify and once and for all put an end to the concern or the question, is Jesus present? Remember when Jesus wanted to heal the father who brought his son to him? Jesus asked him, do you believe I can do that? And the father very honestly said, I do believe, help my unbelief. But we want to say that constantly about the Eucharist. I do believe, help my unbelief. And then we'll get fed. St. Augustine says, we were made for God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in God. We will always have a restlessness, even if we're fed physically, because we were made for God. And Jesus answers that restlessness definitively, for he is the bread of life. He is the person who wants to feed us, not just now spiritually, but for all eternity.